to welcome you. Don't worry, you're not underdressed. I'm a bit. I have to go somewhere else after that. That's why I'm wearing a tie, so you didn't miss the dress code. We are so pleased to host this conference, which is very important for us. One, because it's a conference 934, which is the cycle of conference that we have on very powerful issues and very pressing issues of our time. And indeed, the issue today is a very important issue, the issue of gender equality. Two, also because as we are approaching Women's Day, it was important for us to reflect on the consequences of COVID on the issue of gender equality. And we live in a very digital world, in a very different world now that the COVID has passed, and this is why we wanted to reflect on these issues with three main personalities that I'm going to introduce. But before, since none of them are actually working for the French government, I will just tell you very fast that gender equality is a priority for the French government and for our president. President Macron has declared that gender equality is the great cause of his mandate, and he has passed some very important law. Some measures are extending the paternity, the time of the paternity leave. Some are creating, and this is a very important law, an index which rates companies based on their performance in terms of global gender equality, and this is a public rating which actually has can have some consequences. And yesterday, our Prime Minister announced that the public service and the governments and the different ministries will actually respect also this index. So it will be quite interesting. And I know that in my ministry, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we are really quite equal in terms of promotion for the ambassador's position and all this. But it's very important that these index are being public, because it actually pushes ministries and companies to act. So for this discussion today, we have three personalities who are friends of the Consulate. They are champions of gender equality. First, Jessica Neuwirth, you are a women's rights lawyer. You are an activist. You had different careers and different lives, I will say. You're one of the founders of Equality Now, which is an international organization that campaigns for legal and systemic changes to address violence and discrimination against women. You have also directed the New York office of the High Commission for Human Rights, and you also worked as an expert for a special consultant on sexual violence to the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So, and last year I had the pleasure to we hosted a ceremony in your honor, and it was a great pleasure to see you at this occasion and to see your friends. We have Sara Ziff. Sara, you are human rights activist. Also, you are a former model, and you have founded the Model Alliance, which is a non-profit organization that fosters a culture of accountability in the fashion industry. And we know that the task is huge. This is what we're going to tell us, that there is so much to be done in the fashion industry to regulate and to force the fashion industry to respect the rights of women. Garance Choko. Garance, you're the CEO and founder of Coda Societies. Coda Societies is a social innovation firm that promotes social justice and equality in designing better healthcare system, public administration processes, and much more. Garance is also taking from her time to facilitate and produce a podcast that we had launched at the Consulate, which is called Apropos, which is a wonderful podcast, and I really encourage you to listen to it. It speaks about social issues such as the one of gender equality that we're tackling today. So now I will invite the three of you to take your seat, and Garance will be facilitating the discussion. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Hello, yes, it works. Good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure to be in your company this evening and to celebrate individuals who identify as women and also to celebrate their allies. So it's a pleasure for me to frame and moderate this conversation with Jessica Neuwirth, tongue twister for a French speaker, and Sara Ziff, well easier to pronounce. So tonight our topic is very light. It's gender equity in a post-COVID world. What a broad topic. Welcome to the Consulate General of France. So this is how I decided to frame the conversation. First, I really want for us to appreciate intersectionality as a framework to embrace the multidimensional nature of our identity. Second, I want to touch on how we can leverage the hard lesson we've learned during COVID to frame an even more powerful trajectory to keep on improving gender equality. Lastly, I want to celebrate these two wonderful women who are at the front lines, who are challenging and who are negotiating and shaping, the legislative process. And this is not small feat. So tonight is an opportunity to, for all of us, to pick up tools from this conversation that we can bring back into our diverse world and help us become even more effective champion for gender equality. So, Jessica, welcome, and I'm going to start with you. So can you share more about the areas of women and girls' rights that you're currently focusing on?
Yes, thank you. It's wonderful to be here in this beautiful building, and I really appreciate the warm welcome. As the Consul General said, I started a group called Equality Now in 1992, so I'm feeling a bit old. But also thinking back on, what we've accomplished and what more we have to do, and in some cases, sadly, how we've rolled backwards. But I think that the ideas have moved forward. So when I started Equality Now, one of the problems was that the human rights movement didn't really recognize a lot of the key human rights violations against women as human rights violations. Sex trafficking, female genital mutilation, even domestic violence. There were so many practices that were killing women every day that just weren't considered human rights. And that has just completely changed. So that's good. But after a certain point in time, as the organization grew, I became more and more conscious of the fact that our partners around the world, mostly in developing countries, were not growing. And so I started an offshoot called the Frontline Women's Fund about 10 years ago, which was designed to put more resources on the front lines of the women's movement where they're so urgently needed and they actually go a lot further. So that's one of the things I'm doing now, and I think we have a long way to go there. I think there's a little more of a kind of rhetorical commitment to a redistribution of resources, but when it comes right down to it, we have a very layered, structured kind of movement that makes it hard for women who are really working, in their villages and in their communities on the front lines. And we really saw that. I'll jump ahead to say we really saw the impact of that during COVID.
I will ask you more specifically.
Yes, no, I won't talk about COVID. I won't talk about COVID, but just to come back to what I'm doing now, I actually just spent the entire day with a group of Afghan women leaders who are in New York for the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Last year I started something called the Women's Forum on Afghanistan, which is chaired by the former Foreign Minister of Sweden, Margot Wallström, who's also known for her introduction of feminist foreign policy, which is a wonderful and much needed new concept. I work at Hunter College, where I run the Human Rights Program in the home of Eleanor Roosevelt. And as Eleanor Roosevelt said, one of my favorite things that she said is that human rights starts at home. So the other thing that I've been doing over the last 5 or 10 years is working to get constitutional equality in this country, where many people don't realize we actually don't have equal rights in our Constitution. So there's no constitutional protection against discrimination on the basis of sex. And the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, was first passed in 1982, but in 1972, but it's still not in the Constitution. We're closer than we ever have been, but it's something I've been working on, and started a group called the ERA Coalition, which I'd be glad to talk more about. Maybe I should stop there.
Well, no, thank you. And going from the global to the national and to the US, Sara, it's a pleasure to meet you. Welcome.
Likewise, thank you.
Can you share more about this organization that you founded, Model Alliance, and also like specifically what have been your most significant achievements in advancing like workers' rights in the fashion industry?
Sure. Well, first, like Jessica, I want to thank you all for being here. I'm so honored to share the stage with both of you. And so I come to this work as a labor activist, really by working and growing up in the industry. I come from a family of academics, and I was scouted one day at 14 years old on the street in New York by a photographer, and long story short, became a model, and it was better than babysitting, and it turned into many years of the rest of my life. And I was fortunate to work as a face of big brands, but also experienced the pitfalls of working in a largely unregulated industry. And so I made a documentary about my experiences, the good and the bad, and after sort of being labeled a whistleblower, decided I'd try to set out and you know, seek solutions to address my and other models' concerns. And so over a decade ago now, formed the Model Alliance, had wanted to unionize the industry, realized that wasn't possible because we're generally considered independent contractors, not employees, and so under federal law in the US, we couldn't unionize. And so formed this alternative group. And what really started as trying to have a voice in my work, in a female-dominated industry, fashion where, you know, I think people often sort of would trivialize our concerns. They think fashion is frivolous. You know, how bad can it really be? To helping to start a conversation around the fact that we are workers and we deserve to have rights on the job and be treated fairly just like anyone else who works for a living. So trying to, you know, have people understand and appreciate that we're doing a job, and then pushing back against a powerful industry that has not afforded us really basic things like getting paid, you know, money for the jobs that we do, basic protections against sexual harassment, having proper channels to, you know, file grievances, really like fundamental things that I think all workers should have. And I can speak about it more, but the sort of the broader vision has grown to encompass workers, not only who are highly visible, like my workforce, but really from the runway to the factory floor, looking at a global industry that is largely built on the backs of young women of color, primarily garment workers in the global south.
Thank you. So, Jessica, the definition of gender is perpetually evolving. So, how is the notion of gender fluidity developing and influencing legal conversation around women and girls' rights?
Well, I think, as you said, these notions are evolving so quickly, and it's really challenging for the law to keep up with that. But we did have, not too long ago, a case, Bostock, that many of you may have heard of, that was a really important legal case in the Supreme Court that said, in the context of employment under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, that you could not discriminate on the basis of, that's what the Title VII says, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex in employment, and the Supreme Court said that word sex included gay and transgender people. So that was a very important decision, and from the point of view of the Equal Rights Amendment, which I mentioned earlier, which also has the word sex in it, it would follow that if we could get that kind of constitutional equality, then it wouldn't just be in the employment context, it would be across the board, that we would have that kind of legal protection. But, as I mentioned, we're very far from getting that, and I was just earlier this week in Washington for a Senate hearing on the Equal Rights Amendment, where almost the entire attack was on transgender rights. And I think the progress we've made has also created a big backlash, and that's what we're struggling with. And it's going through the courts. Since you asked me about legal, it's just a very fluid area right now in the court system. And as you know, it's everything from bathrooms to prisons. And field hockey teams came up in the hearing, and we had a wonderful young woman. I'll just tell one little story because it was so moving. A young actress who's a college senior testifying at the Senate hearing, and these really kind of older white men who just had so much trouble with all of this were attacking all of these ideas and put it for some reason in the context of field hockey. And she just looked at them and she just was like, we don't care about that. That is not our problem. We have so many issues that are so fundamentally important. But I think, what we do see, and of course, that's the composition of our judiciary, not just our Senate. So I think the legal situation is going to be complicated.
So, Sara, in your industry, which is an industry where, even though it's not safe, individuals can be encouraged to express the full spectrum of their identity, right? So your organization represents workers that identify as men, women, non-binary. So how do you define gender equality or equity in the context of your advocacy work?
Yeah, I think we can all agree that society's binary gender roles are limiting, and so I've always been drawn to fashion as having a sort of a power of self-determination, not having to sort of fit into one bucket or the other. And I think many people who work in or enjoy fashion use it to explore their gender identity, and there's an appreciation for the idea of gender being a construction. And gender fluid fashion, I think, provides a visual staging to imagine identity on a spectrum. That said, fashion, which, appears to be, the face of fashion is female, and yet I think it's only, there was a McKinsey report that came out a few years ago that said only 14% of major brands have a female executive in charge. So, the models, the garment workers, they're all women, but it's actually mostly men who are running these companies, which I thought was interesting.
Yes. I like that, interesting. All right, now that we have solved the definition and the fluidity of gender, let's go into COVID. So, Jessica, the data shows that violence against girls and women has increased during COVID. So how has this phenomenon impacted your field's priorities? So,
yeah, I mean, I think as we know, COVID came so suddenly and so dramatically, and the message of COVID was it's not safe to go out. But for so many women, it wasn't safe to stay home. And all of the support systems that the women's movement has built were really challenged because shelters had to close, they weren't safe, and even law enforcement wasn't responding in the same way that it was, and nobody was being sent to prison for domestic violence, perpetrating offenses. So it was just a real nightmare for women around the world, and I think there wasn't You know, there wasn't a lot of easy solutions. There were a lot of really exciting community initiatives where women and their neighbors would band together and do things. What I saw in the women's movement was that, which we see often in cases of emergencies of all kinds, is the shift immediately to what's the need and how do we address it. So, for example, women's groups previously were doing something completely unrelated. Suddenly they're making masks because nobody has masks. Or they're just providing all kinds of services. They had to go to the market, for example. You know, we were like, stay home, but in many places, you know, it was a life and death situation. You have no income, you have to go to the market. So they would create really interesting ways of like passing money to each other just so that they wouldn't have the kind of contact that might be vulnerable. So I think the creativity came through, but it has been a very, very challenging time.
And are there been some policies, you know, new policy articulation and definition, but also implementation that are like, you know, specifically targeting some of the crises that emerged during COVID? But they didn't emerge, they maybe re-emerged because they were always there, like violence against women.
Right. I think it exaggerated. So I think on violence against women, also, you know, just on discriminatory impact. You know, we studied the discriminatory impact of COVID on Black and brown communities and women in particular, and people who just, you know, didn't have the same health infrastructure to begin with, and then suddenly this comes along like a tidal wave, and you really just see incredible disparity in numbers of people who were dying and not getting the care that they needed.
Thank you. So Sara, from your labor advocacy perspective, can you share like the economic and social impact of COVID on the fashion industry workers? And yes.
Sure. Yeah, we actually did a survey in April 2020 in partnership with the Worker Institute at Cornell. We surveyed about 250 fashion workers to understand the impact of COVID on our industry. And you know, traditional runway shows and photo shoots had become impossible under social distancing and stay-at-home orders. So there was obviously going to be a big economic impact. Many people were owed money by their clients or agencies. About 2/3 were concerned about being able to pay for housing. This is like considered such a glamorous industry where people are so privileged, but actually people were struggling just to, you know, pay their essential bills. Many of them didn't even have health insurance. I think the pandemic exposed how much our lives and our work are intertwined, and the fact that, you know, our healthcare is tied to employment was extremely problematic, with so many women forced out of the workforce. And I think Vice President Harris declared it a national emergency back in, you know, January of 2021. But in terms of our survey and our industry, notably but not surprisingly, the pandemic also exacerbated the industry's racial disparities. So, you know, when we asked, for example, how confident they felt in pushing for COVID-related precautions while working, almost half of the white fashion workers who we surveyed said they felt very confident or extremely confident in asking, compared to just about 20% of the Black fashion workers. So I thought that was really noticeable in our findings.
No, thank you for this, and that's a perfect introduction to my next question for Jessica. So we know that the experience of BIPOC women and girls is different from the experience of white women and girls in America. So how is intersectionality refining how advocacy is carried out?
I think I'm very glad that there's much greater awareness of intersectionality. I think, you know, it's always been there, but there's just having the term and having it become more popular and in our mainstream thinking has started to have an impact on what the women's movement looks like and also what its priorities are. So if you look at issues like equal pay, for example, where we say, oh, women make 82 cents on the dollar for every dollar a man makes. But actually for African American women, it's 60 cents on the dollar. And for Latino women, it's 55 cents on the dollar. So I think it's really important for us to disaggregate those kinds of numbers and really understand, you know, from the point of view of intersectionality, what that discriminatory impact is on people who are being discriminated against in several ways. And obviously discrimination against women hits women of color much harder than it hits white women in just about every way. So to be honest, I think our movement has been a bit slow to wake up to this, and I think we have a lot to do. But more and more organizations are understanding that they need to reflect the population that they represent. And so I think we're seeing more and more diversity of women in the leadership of the women's movement, which is super important.
Yeah. Sara, like, the new generation of models and influencers and Gen Z in general, we were talking about that earlier, have like a better vocabulary, right, to talk about identity, to talk about equality. So do you feel that they've been promoting like healthier dialogues about gender equity, but also like how is that translating into like behavior change?
Well, my mind goes to the Me Too movement, and the fact that I think it certainly raised awareness for the prevalence of sexual harassment, sexual assault, but I think too often we heard about individual bad actors and not a system of oppression. And we know that economic exploitation begets sexual exploitation. And that's very clear in the fashion industry and is like closely tied to the work that I do. So, you know, it's normal to wait months to get paid for a job. There's a lack of financial transparency. Many women and girls are actually working in debt to their agencies. And that's why we have introduced a bill here in New York called the Fashion Workers Act, which aims to bring financial transparency and accountability to New York's fashion industry. You asked about Gen Z, and you know, I met recently with a group of young women of color who are influencers. Actually, they said they don't want to be called influencers, they're content creators. I didn't know that was like had a negative connotation, but I guess it does. They had just spoken to the New York Times. You may have read the article, it came out just a couple of days ago, about their difficulty getting paid for their work. And I said, you know, how did you manage to speak out? Because people of my generation, because I feel like I'm old, you know, relatively speaking to them, are just terrified to speak out, understandably so. And they said, well, we were just fed up. And I thought, power to you. You know, maybe there is a sort of more of a sense of fearlessness among the younger generation who can just take to social media and speak out in a way that we weren't able to.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn something extremely dire and negative into a look toward a brighter horizon. So, Jessica, with Roe v. Wade, have there been examples of men becoming stronger allies? Or is there a what lesson can be learned?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the destruction of Roe v. Wade, you know, has just been a devastating blow, and not only to women, in a couple of ways. It's a warning to everyone. I think abortion is an issue that affects men as well as women, but even more than that, the decision of the Supreme Court, if you read it, suggests that other rights might be rolled back as well, including even something like the right to contraception, which is also under our law a right to privacy. So the attack on the right to privacy, which came out in this case as abortion, the next case it could be contraception. And I have to just say, I'm so proud that my cousin, who was French, Lucien Neuwirth, was a longtime member of the French Parliament, and he led the effort to legalize contraception in France many decades ago. So I feel like it's in my DNA. that we have to fight for this. But it's crazy to me that we're even talking about not only abortion, but even contraception and other issues. And of course, all of that affects men dramatically. In general, you know, our belief is that sex equality is not just about women. It's about men and women, and it's just as good for men as it is for women. So I think yes.
Sarah, you are the mom. I was about to say the new mom, but it's been 2 years now, so you're still in, you know, you're starting to get used to your role. But you're a mother of a 2-year-old little girl. And so with that in mind, what is your call to action to ensure, you know, a world that is more equitable for her to evolve in a healthy way?
Oh, well, I don't think I'd ever let my daughter enter my industry. And my call to action would be hopefully not apply to her because she'll escape what I went through. But it would be twofold, I think. One is that we have been running a campaign to raise awareness for the Adult Survivors Act. It's a bill that we helped to pass here in New York that has basically lifted the statute of limitations for people who experience sexual assault. So regardless of when you were assaulted, you can pursue justice through the courts until November. It's time limited. And this has been incredibly meaningful to me and other survivors. And I think it's just, I hope it can be a model to other states and countries when we think about the need for statute of limitations reform. We've been working with a group of survivors former models who worked in France and who have all claimed that they were abused by Gerald Marie, a very well-known agency president. The criminal investigation was closed because of the statute of limitations, but there are numerous women with very credible claims, and I think that all survivors, regardless of when they experienced the abuse, should be able to experience healing and closure. So that my call to action would be for statute of limitations reform in France. It would also be to join us in helping to pass the Fashion Workers Act. We're looking ahead at the legislative session here in New York and going to be ramping up our campaign. Would love any support for anyone who's wanting to get involved. Please contact us at the Model Alliance.
Thank you. And Jessica, what is your call to action?
My call to action is, it would just be a political call. We worked really hard to get the right to vote. Certainly women did in this country. We have to use that right to be fighting so hard for all these individual pieces of legislation, you know, that in so many cases seem like they should just sail through. You know, I think the problem we have is that people don't vote. Our turnout is so low, and if more people voted, our legislative bodies would look completely different. Our whole country would look completely different. So we have to really use the vote that we have to make sure that the people we elect really represent us, because right now they don't.
Thank you. Right, that concludes our conversation, our close conversation. And so now I'm happy to, open it up to you and yeah, and welcome your questions. Please, yes. And don't be shy, please.
I'm Farah Balmer. I'm an international relations analyst. I work with a think tank kind of looking at water and climate security for the global south predominantly. And I lead a project on women and water security. So this is very appropriate for me, and I really enjoyed your reflections. And thank you for all the great work that you do. Something that I wanted to flag and also kind of get your insights on in your routine work is, of course, COVID has been an eye-opener in terms of, the disproportionate impacts on women or other gender groups in every society, but Global South a lot more, and we've talked about women of color a lot. But climate change coupled with it and the water stress coupled with it, it's just further highlighted what are the challenges that women are experiencing. I mean, for example, in India and Africa, women walk like 4 hours every day just to collect water. And in COVID, where water became this necessity, right, that became much of a mission for them to achieve. And of course, compromise their health, compromise the health of their children and households and what have you. So you mentioned, Jessica, feminist foreign policy, and I'm going to closely follow that international relations. So Summer, just wanted to check, what kind of work are you doing within your advocacy, which couples sustainability, natural disasters, and gender equality? And same for you, Sarah, in the fashion industry, it's a water-intensive industry, and sustainability is kind of at the heart of these conversations. So how's that equation kind of working with gender equality as well? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an existential issue that's only now coming to the fore. But when I came into the women's movement in the early 1990s, one of our heroes at the time was Wangari Maathai, who was a Kenyan activist, so ahead of her time, who knew, who was totally focused on the environment. And I think that there's been a piece of the women's movement forever that has focused on the environment. And to come back to intersectionality, there's that issue, intersectionality, that everything relates to everything else. And I think in the women's movement, the goal has always been to have a comprehensive vision that includes all of these pieces. Women, peace, and security is a big part of it. Environment is a big part of it. And legal rights is a big part of it. It all fits together in so many ways. So I think, the sad thing is, if we had all listened to Wangari Maathai, we wouldn't be in the climate crisis that we're in now. I mean, that was decades ago. But I do think that the women's movement is doing quite a lot and needs support to really play a lead role.
And I would just add that I think, fashion likes to consider itself forward-thinking when it comes to social issues, but can actually be very old-fashioned. And I think that in trying to address climate issues, we also need to make sure that the massive workforce in developing countries like Bangladesh, who are working in the garment industry and who are literally sometimes risking their lives on the job because of these unsafe factory conditions, that they are able to unionize, that they're able to establish safe, sort of a safe, fair work environment. And I think it's sort of a complementary crisis of recognition. You have highly visible people on our side of the industry who are sort of camouflaged by a glamorous facade, and then on the other side you have young women workers who are largely invisible, but on both sides trying to just have a voice in our work. And I think that is it's part of the part of what's needed.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Yeah. Do we have another question?
Hi, my name is Matthew Eckelman, and I've actually done some work for Model Alliance and years ago for Equality Now in Nairobi on FGM. My question is around trafficking, because I see there's a lot of overlap in both of your work, and I was wondering if maybe Jessica and then Sarah, Jessica, you could speak to some of the loopholes you've seen in combating trafficking on the international legal dimension, and then similarly, Sarah, loopholes that you've seen exploited within the fashion industry around trafficking.
Yeah, I hope I haven't lost my voice here. Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I think in that regard, I have to say France has been one of the great leaders. But to come back to this idea of intersectionality, I think that's applicable too in the context of sex trafficking and maybe labor trafficking as well. We have to look at these problems in a holistic way. What are the root causes? How are we addressing them? What is driving the industry? And in the case of sex trafficking, I think certainly the sex trade is a big part of the problem. So that there's you know, there's a lot of money behind it, unlike an issue like FGM, which you mentioned, you know, so it's very hard to fight. But I think France has been one of the leaders in adopting a law that really understands that people who are purchased for sex and people who buy sex, who sell sex, are differently situated. That if you're a victim of poverty, you know, that's a form of coercion too, and that you really deserve a route out of the poverty. While the person who's completely privileged and buying you, you know, basically commodifying you, needs to be penalized. And I think France has a very robust law building on the Swedish model before it, and a model now known as the equality model, that just says, on the one hand, let's help people get out of that industry because it's not a healthy industry and they deserve a better way to address their needs and make a living. And let's make sure that we really penalize people who think they can just buy other people.
And I would just add that, you know, we have been working with trafficking survivors at the Model Alliance. In many cases, the modeling industry is used as a guise for trafficking. So people are presented with, you know, job opportunities that are not real. There's a huge problem of modeling scams. And that's one of the reasons why we've introduced the Fashion Workers Act, to help people distinguish, you know, the real job opportunities from the scams. It's also not a coincidence that in many of these high-profile cases, whether it was, you know, Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, Bill Cosby, so many of these known predators preyed on girls with sort of promises of modeling work, and we're going through these unlicensed, unregulated agencies. And so thank you for the question, because you know, people often don't think about trafficking when they think of fashion, but it actually is a breeding ground for that type of abuse.
Thank you. Yes?
Thank you. I'm wondering what you think about the following as a background. I'm actually a nonprofit leader in the immigration conversation in the United States, but I'm also a angel investor in early stage startups, technology companies. What you see often is the immigrant who is a woman. Certainly transgender is yet another issue entirely, but the woman who is an immigrant, the woman who attempts to be the startup entrepreneur, is always having a very difficult time versus the man who is in exactly the same position with the same even educational background. And I see this in pitch days, you know, where we see 10 pitches. We'll see maybe 2 immigrants in that pitch. We'll see maybe one who's a woman. We'll never see a woman who happens to be an immigrant. How do you think about that? I mean, how do you get past that, which is, you know, more important than you might think, because it enhances the economic activity of the entire nation, what we're trying to do there. Both bring in qualified immigrants and bring qualified entrepreneurs to create businesses and jobs.
I'll answer really quickly first. I think that by identifying these women immigrants who are entrepreneurs and being deliberate in providing them with the capital to start their business, you know, and providing them with support along the way to ensure the success of their business is a very practical way to do so. So it demands that there is like more of a search, you know, and to look for these talents, right? They're there, like the woman immigrant. I'm a woman immigrant and I have my company. So you have, you know, people who come to the United States come with degrees, come with a lot of expertise. It's just accessibility. So if investors are more, you know, curious and really like taking the time to find these talents, and then when they find them, being able to like support them financially and then train them to reduce risk and accelerate their success, I think just being deliberate and intentional about it.
Yeah, I would just build on that. I mean, I think my experience, I mentioned it earlier, in the women's movement is a very, white movement. If you want to change that, and if I just do an ad tomorrow, International Women's Rights Lawyers, I'll get all white women candidates probably. So you have to take that extra step, in my opinion. You have to go out and look for people, because it's a very closed universe sometimes. And I think that immigrant woman that never gets in front of you is out there, just can't get to that road, and if you pull her in, then you'll get to see her and help her. And I think that there's a proactivity that has to happen. Otherwise, we end up with the status quo repeating itself. And I think it's a really hard thing to do. It's just hard because we're not used to doing things that way. But I think that nothing could be more important.
Do you want to? Thank you. Thank you for this question. Do we have anyone else? Yes, please, sir. And then I have one about the GCD.
Thank you. The title of tonight's topic is Gender Equality in a Post-COVID World, which suggests, to me anyway, that there may be differences with the pre-COVID world. And in that case, what did the pandemic do to create these differences, and what are these differences? Thank you.
I'll let you take this one, just please.
Well, that's a hard question. I'll do my best. I think, it's generally true in crises. I've seen this in other kinds of crises, that sometimes they create opportunity. When you tear something down, you have an opportunity to build it in a completely different way. Instead of like the term build back, there's that new term build forward, so that if something gets destroyed, it just gives you an opportunity. And I think that one little example for me with COVID was Zoom. Before COVID, we had all these meetings, and it was really a very less egalitarian forum, because people who could travel and this and that, people who had money to bring people or fund themselves. With Zoom, we could do a discussion on the impact of COVID on violence against women. We could have women from 20 countries around the world. It costs nothing. So there was that kind of opportunity to do things differently. And I think it does bring more equality, not just gender equality, but a certain kind of democracy and speech access. So it's a little bit of looking at the silver lining. I mean, obviously it was just a horrendous time for many people, but I do think that in many other kinds of crises as well, what I've seen is that people just end up leaping forward because they have that opportunity. All the men get wiped out because of a war, so the next thing you know, in Rwanda, there's more than 50% women in parliament. It wasn't planned that way, but I think sometimes things come out that way.
Is there enough? Yes, please.
Oh yeah, I'm Garance Choko. I am a woman in business and academic as well. And I've been in a lot of cycles, including, Ivy Leagues and my PhD there. So I want to address the question of the gentleman in the front. It's really refreshing to have an investor or someone of your caliber that wants to be proactive in investing in women. And many of us, the issue with funding women, especially minorities, is that many of us don't feel comfortable going to those spaces. We know about them. Usually statistics, about 0.3% of women of color are being funded by a lot of the venture funds and all those places. So people don't feel, what's the point of going when I have less than 1% chance of getting it? And also, it's not about, for example, I said my PhD at Cornell. It's been a roller coaster for 10 years. 10 years. Not my fault, 10 years. When we go to those circles and there's a problem or something happens, it's very hard to get help. So many businesses, by the way, I have a women's group in business, with highly qualified women, a lot of Caucasians, a lot of people that look, some people that look at myself as well, but very diverse all over the world. So they have multiple degrees, highly qualified, they have their own businesses. If you want to fund it, we could do that as well. So the thing is that it's not only about getting women out of difficult places, getting women out of trafficking, but we have to support them in the process. Support them 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line. Okay, we have to put resources. If you're in that circle, it's an issue, we're here to help you. You could talk to us, we're still here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do I see another hand? Is there anyone? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. My sort of question or topic to bring up is kind of targeted mainly towards Jessica, just because earlier you mentioned you were at a Senate hearing and you talked about how the conversation was so strongly centered around transgender issues. And I wanted to hear sort of your thoughts or input on where that intersects between trans youth and trans women of color with the women's movement and trafficking and sort of any gendered issue.
So it's a little broad, but you know, I think that one of the things that the women's movement has always wanted to do is change gender stereotypes. Gender stereotypes are just harmful for everybody. They keep men in a certain place, they keep women in a certain place, and I think this, you know, relatively new concept of gender fluidity has opened up a whole new universe. And what I was thinking in that Senate hearing, listening to these different generations talk about it so differently, is it's very scary for some people. And it's hard to know why. Like, I think the younger people are saying, why is this so scary? And I just don't know the answer to that. But I do think that, while there are differences, you know, there are controversies within the women's movement and the trans movement about what's exactly fair and what's not fair, that's normal. I mean, I think we have to discuss those things. We have to be able to have a good discussion about what feels fair and equal. But the bottom line principle, which is what the ERA is that no one should ever face discrimination on the basis of their sex. You know, what does that mean in this particular case? We may not all agree on the answer, we may not know the answer, and in 10 years the answer may change because we may all think about it differently. So I think it's a process. And when it feels frustrating, you know, what I do is I just look back 10 years and I just realize how far we've come in opening up our minds to think about new issues in new ways. And it's hard, you know, if you grow up, like I was just saying before the panel, for me, like I teach at Hunter and I have these college-age students and, you know, they'll say things like when people talk about the gay movement or something and they'll be, oh, that's so binary. And it's funny to me because when I was growing up, like binary was radical. You know, everything was like straight. So all of a sudden there was binary. Now binary is so passé, it's just disdainful, you know, to these young people. So I think we just have to have that historical perspective and know that change is not easy and that we have to get people used to ideas. And I have to also just say the role of the media is so important. If you see trans people in a TV show, it's like seeing a woman president in a TV show. You imagine it in a different way because if it's in a TV show, it must be like acceptable. And I think making things more comfortable and accessible, you know, and a feeling that they're okay is a way of making people feel safe. But for some reason, and I don't know, this trans issue has just sparked like this anger and fear and hatred that just honestly seems bizarre to me.
Thank you for doing this. My name is Nicolas Revis. I'm a French journalist with the international newswire AFP, Agence France Presse, here in New York. My question regards transgender issues. As you may know, the New York Times has been criticized recently by organizations of LGBTQ people for its coverage of transgender issues. Do you believe that the number of teenagers who express the desire of changing their identity and their gender is on the rise in the US? And so do you believe that it's an issue and that their rights are being protected in the US?
Okay, a couple of questions in there, I guess. I'm not an expert on the numbers, but I do think that what we have to keep in mind is as the conversation opens up, it may not be the numbers, it may just be the awareness. You know, and I was recently reading a biography of Polly Murray, who was a very famous civil rights lawyer, you know, in our country, an African-American woman who really believed that she was male. And it's so old, like, I don't know, I think she might have died before I was born. And so you just see that, but it doesn't ever get quantified. And people who might have felt that way have been invisible, I think, for many, many centuries even. So I don't know about the numbers, if it's growing or if it's just more public. And are people getting the rights they need, if that was the question? No, absolutely not. I mean, I think that's the struggle of the moment, is how do we fix that? And this Bostock case that I mentioned came down, and it was honestly a little bit surprising and very welcome, because it gave some protection in the employment context to people, but that's just one context. And obviously we know there's a ton of violence. It's not just, you know, employment or financial things or other, you know, other civil rights things. It's actually life and death for many people. So I don't think we're getting the protection we need. And it's just something we have to work on, but I don't know about the numbers.
Thank you. And I have a last question before we conclude this conversation, and it's like a very practical one. So, Sara, you've been pushing for ACT to be passed. So, what is a step-by-step, very very high level, process for change, right? So through your campaigns, what is your steps, by step, to pass new legislation, to pass new acts? Can you simplify it for us?
Well, I'm embarrassed to do it in front of Jessica because I feel like she's the expert here. But
you're a practitioner.
No, we've as a small but mighty organization, we've passed multiple pieces of legislation in New York and California, and I think the first piece of legislation that we introduced was a child labor bill. When we looked at the laws on the books, we found that kids working in New York as models were not even covered under child labor law, strangely. They were cut out of protections that were afforded to other child performers like actors and singers and dancers. And this was something that was, deeply personal for me as someone who entered the industry at the young age of 14. And I wrote an op-ed about this issue, and I think it was on the anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which was, kind of led to the birth of the American labor movement. And it was, basically young immigrant women and girls who, over a century ago, were working at a factory that is now an NYU building by Washington Square Park. And, Elizabeth Warren recently gave that speech referencing the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire when she was running for president. But, I said, a century later, we still have young people who are some of the most visible child workers in the world who don't have basic labor protections. And that op-ed, I think, was read by a lawmaker who reached out to me and said they wanted to, this was a circuitous answer to your question, wanted to, work with me and the organization to draft a bill. And that was the first of several. So I've just sort of learned by doing.
Yes. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for participating and being here this evening. Thank you, the two of you, for having such a rich and productive conversation. Thank you very much.